Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host and storyteller, Sean, and this is part 3, the final part of Chris Eubank's career profile. I hope you've been listening to the first 2 parts. I've really enjoyed putting them together, and I've really enjoyed seeing the feedback from everybody that has listened to parts 1 and 2 and the stories that we've put together so far. There's been some great stories, things that not many of us probably knew, and certainly myself, I didn't know certain stories about, situations that he'd been involved in outside of the ring that make sense as to why maybe he changed the way he was in the ring. So if you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2, strongly recommend that you go and do that before listening to this final part of Chris Eubank's career profile. If you've not followed the podcast on social media, please make sure you do. At the BTR Boxing Podcast Network, all over social media, all over the necessaries. And of course, if you've not subscribed to the podcast, you can do that on any available podcasting app, either the BTR Boxing Podcast or the Career Profiles Podcast on there as well. So at the end of part 2, I left it in a position where he'd just had the fight with Ray Close, and I was telling you a story about how his relationship had started to blossom with a certain Mike Tyson. And during that time, during the 90s when Mike Tyson was incarcerated, it's how Chris Eubank explains about their relationship. And I put a couple of stories in there which were directly from Chris's autobiography. And now we're going back to the story in part 3 where we move forward from the Ray Close fight. And at the time, there was a lot of talk about a Eubank-Ben 3 match at Wembley Stadium with figures of £5 million being thrown around. But unfortunately for us, it just never happened. Barry Hearn and Chris Eubank had been busy, and for many months during this period of time, they'd actually been negotiating an unprecedented television deal with Sky. The satellite channel were keen to sell dishes and win subscribers, and they actually saw Chris as the ideal vehicle to do that. After that vital Ray Close win, the position was only strengthened for Chris. You've got to remember, at the time, ratings for Chris's fights were repeatedly record-breaking. Sky bought into Chris's character, his ring persona, his style, the clothes, the English gentleman look. They knew that Chris would win viewers over. Much was also made of Chris's slogan, "Simply the best." Chris had originally used that phrase in reply to Nigel Benn and a taunt from him which said, "I'm going to get you," but it was actually Barry Hearn's wife, Susan, who thought of making that the public byline for Chris. Every fighter has a gimmick, they have to, but Chris wanted no such fanfare. Chris was for truth and integrity, he wasn't really into gimmicks. However, Barry explained that it could be of benefit, so Chris just thought, I'll do whatever it takes, I'm not the PR man. If it helps, let's go with it. That phrase, of course, would become synonymous with Chris, but one thing that was always misunderstood was that Chris wasn't using it with reference to the fight business. He'd never talked about simply the best as a boxer, but as a person, Chris thought he was simply the best, and that was his take on it. Of course, as for the Tina Turner song, he made an unannounced entrance on stage with that particular performer, Tina Turner, one year at the Mobo Awards, which, to Tina's surprise, Chris rocked up on stage. Now, the Sky deal was all about big money. £10 million for 8 fights effectively. The richest ever contract in European boxing. There were many high-powered meetings, which for Chris was all part of the job, facilitating his earning capacity. One such meeting was arranged with all the very top executives of Sky and all the various financial parties involved. Chris turned up in the full English gear with a riding case, which was actually meant for polo gear, but he carried it with his picture cards in and various other personal possessions. So they sat down for the meeting, and Chris said he could tell that all eyes were on him. The most senior executive present actually said, "Would you like some tea or coffee, Mr. Eubank?" Chris's reply, "Yes, please. May I partake of a coffee, double espresso with hot cream, please? If you don't have any cream, would you mind sending someone out to get it?" Chris thought it would be a good way of breaking the ice. Although the executives offered no hint of their feelings, it was all very poker face and proper, and Chris could tell they were bemused by his actions. When the drinks arrived, the same gentleman said, "Would you like some biscuits, Mr. Eubank?" Eubank's response, "No, thank you. I have my own." At that moment, Chris pulled out a delicate silver tin containing a selection of biscuits, and he said, "Gentlemen, here are some of the finest biscuits known to man. These are the type of culinary delight that you cannot but eat all in one sitting." Chris meticulously removed the ornate lid, offering them to the stunned faces in front of him, and said, "Would any of you gentlemen care for a biscuit? They are truly delicious. In fact, they are simply the best." Shortly after, they signed the deal. The deal was announced at the Royal Geographical Society in Greenwich, watched over by portraits and some of the great explorers. Although 5 of the 8 fights were scheduled to take place in the UK, the bouts were touted as a globe-trotting campaign. Barry Hearn said it was a mission to spread the gospel of Eubankism. As part of the deal, Chris made a video where he transformed into a panther by an amazing £100,000 worth of special effects. Chris said it was a long day's work, but it was fun. And the only disappointment was when the animal trainer would not allow Chris to get into the cage to get acquainted before they worked together. The 8 fights would take place roughly over 1 calendar year, between July 1994 and June 1995. In the process, Chris would become the highest paid fighter in the world outside of the heavyweight division. Indeed, it was said that some Sky executives who signed Chris rather than Lennox Lewis got into a lot of trouble. In pure boxing terms, many observers considered this schedule a ludicrous proposition. Someone called Chris insane, to which he jokingly replied, "I never said I was sane." Many insiders felt taking on a world title fight roughly every 6 weeks wouldn't allow Chris sufficient time to recover between fights, even for cuts to heal. The British Medical Association stated that they felt such a workload at such a high level could have a detrimental effect on his permanent state of health. But as Chris has said many times throughout this story, he had that Godspeed, and this was his business. This was the sort of opportunity that Chris had been working years and years for in the gym. Now, coming away from the boxing for a short story, there was one day in 1994 when Chris came back to his house in Hove at a time when they were having lots of building work done on it. Near the kitchen, there was a man coming down Chris's stairs from the bedrooms, and Chris said, "Hey, how are you?" And then a very strange conversation followed. "Hello," he replied. "Who are you working with?" asked Chris. "John Regan." No, I'm not working with anyone. I've just come to see you." "I was walking into the kitchen," Chris said. "What do you mean, you've just come to see me? Who are you?" "My name is Russell Bennett." "What are you doing here?" "You've just come from upstairs." "I've come to see you. I was just having a look around." By now, Chris was beginning to realise that he had a bit of a situation on his hands. He was walking around Chris's private quarters, calm as you like, and when he spoke to Chris, he was perfectly casual. He was carrying a bag on his shoulder, and Chris could see that there was nothing in there, but Chris asked anyway. Russell showed Chris inside the bag, and it was indeed empty. Chris is slightly concerned at this point, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And he replied as calm as can be, "The reason you have done everything you've done is because of the love I've been sending out to you, and the prayers I've been saying for you." Chris stood there listening to this total stranger, telling him that they're going to save the world together because they are 2 people who have love in them. Chris said, "I kept direct eye contact with him at all times, and if I had sensed a hint of nervousness, I would have restrained him there and then. He was, after all, in my house. Nobody else was home, but there wasn't a hint of nervousness in his demeanour. So I asked him, 'Where are you living?' And he said, 'I'm not. I'm looking for a place.' So I called a fellow who was working for me, gave him £20 and said, 'Will you take this gentleman to the council office and see if they can get him a place?' So they took Russell's details, and shortly after, they managed to get in touch with his mother. His mother told him that he had actually escaped from a mental institution. When Chris called her up, she said, "I thought that would be the first place he would go." Apparently, he had been obsessed with Chris for some time. He was only 24. And that was that. Well, or so Chris thought. 2 months later, Chris was in London when he received a call to say there was a man in the garage who'd locked himself in his truck. They said that he wouldn't talk at all, other than to say his name was Russell. So Chris instructed them to put the phone they were calling Chris on through the truck window, whereupon Chris said, Listen, Russell, you can't keep doing this. This is what they call stalking. This is against the law. Russell quietly responded, "Okay, I'll go." And he promptly jumped down out of the truck and left. A couple of weeks later, Russell broke into the house while they were out, but a neighbour saw Russell and alerted the police. They found him hiding in the gables where the truck garage meets the house roof. After this third instance, Karen went to the courts and took out a restraining order on him, which banned him from coming within a mile or so of the house. 2 months after that, Chris was in Dubai on business. Last thing at night, he was on the phone to Karen, just catching up on the day's events back home. And as they were talking, he heard a siren in the background. Karen was very tired and she said, "Damn, the alarm's gone off in the other house." She said she was going to check because sometimes a spider will make a web in front of the sensors and trigger the alarm. Now, in light of the recent events, Chris wasn't comfortable with this at all, but she went across to the other house and pushed the front door open. She couldn't see anything, so she started to walk into the living room. As she did so, she heard footsteps upstairs. She told Chris. She screamed, "Who the fuck is in the house?" And she ran out and locked the door behind her, and then called the police. She handled it pretty well given the circumstances. Meanwhile, Chris is in Dubai on business, wondering what the commotion was. And of course he was very uncomfortable. He called his brother, who got there about the same time as the police. They sent sniffer dogs into the house, and guess what? They found Russell in the attic room, crouched up in the galleried beams of Chris's gymnasium. He was actually wearing a pair of Chris's boxing shorts and had a workman's hammer in his hand. Of course, it was very disturbing, a very disturbing series of events, very unsettling, especially for Chris's wife and children. Chris obviously was frequently away on business as well at the time, and this exacerbated the nervousness. Chris said to the police, "What can I do to protect my family?" The police's response, "Basically, you can't do anything because he hasn't harmed anyone." Chris said, "The fellow who killed John Lennon hadn't harmed anyone before that day either." Now, as far as I'm aware, and all the research that I did for these episodes led me to believe that Chris never had any other interactions with Russell following this particular moment. So, there you go, another story outside of the ring, which is something I wasn't aware of at that period of time. Of course, things wasn't as well publicised back then. I know this particular incident was, but it's another story that's just another chapter of Chris Eubank's life. And it leads me into yet another story, of course, about a certain relationship with a certain boxer that didn't go so well. One day, they had a very high-level meeting with some advertising executives from an agency working with Levi's. And at the time, Max Clifford was with Chris as he started to tell them a story about Prince Naseem Hamed. Bearing in mind that Max is standing there with his hands in his pockets, listening intently. Chris was explaining to these executives why he wasn't speaking to Naseem Hamed at the time. He'd seen him on ITV saying, "Chris Eubank stole all my moves." Bearing in mind that Chris is 8 years older than Naseem, it seemed strange for Naseem to make them comments. Of course, Naz was a cheeky person at the time whom Chris had always offered advice to and always gave his time to. Chris said that Naz had his mobile number if he ever needed him, and he regularly used to call Chris for advice. He was even at Chris's wedding. Chris said he was just a cheeky little character, and I always liked him for that. So when he heard this statement on television, he was very upset. He felt it was such a snide thing to do. For a start, they were Chris's moves. But it was knowing how considerate Chris had been towards him that pained him. So shortly after this, he was at the Royal Lancaster Hotel in London for a charity boxing event. Naseem had come to a changing room, and he and Chris were talking. Chris said to him, "Naz, how could you do that to me?" "Me? I don't mind, but how can you lie to people?" Chris tried to pass over to him the philosophy that your boxing career isn't just about how good a fighter you are, you have to also be a good person as well. Apologising to Chris didn't cut it. The apology for Chris needed to be to the ITV viewers, the great masses. He listened, Naseem, and he said to Chris, "I don't think you want me to apologise for me. I think you want me to do it for you." Chris's response, "This isn't about me. It's about you. You lied. You need to tell people your truth. Explain to them that maybe you were cajoled into it. Explain to them that your trainer, Brendan Ingle, made you say it, like you've told me. Tell them the truth. I can't accept you lying to the public at large because you'll hurt yourself. Can't you see that? Chris was very adamant about it, so he went on to give him an example after another example of the same principle, basically trying to show Naz that what he had done was underhanded and backstabbing and that things won't work out well if you live your life that way. Chris said, in life, if you cheat, you'll be found out. You can't be imitation. Imitation is suicide. Be yourself. You're talented enough. You don't have to put me down or stamp on my name to climb the ladder. You have to work. It's about substance. It's not about making me look bad. Then Chris quoted him a small extract from the poem Desterdra, which was believed by some to have been found in a churchyard in Baltimore. And one of the stanzas of that poem goes like this: if you compare yourself with others, you may become vain and bitter, for always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself. He also quoted from a pop song that was out at the time called Everybody's Free. With those lyrics listed a litany of guidance, one of which was, don't waste your time on jealousy. Sometimes you're ahead and sometimes you're behind. The race is long, and in the end, it is only with yourself. Chris said that he was just trying to pass on these real nuggets of advice to Naseem, but he couldn't take it on, and Chris became quite frustrated. In the end, he spoke to him and said, if you don't understand or perhaps won't accept what I'm saying, especially that you should apologise to the ITV viewers, then remember this. I expect you will make champion, and I expect you will win all the honours. I expect you'll make your name and fame. When you do, and they make you king for a day, as they will, you understand this. When you walk by me, when you see me anywhere near you, walk on by like the little runt that you are. Now remember, Chris was telling this story in the hotel to all these advertising executives, and Max had been listening quietly, fascinated all along. He was standing bolt upright, just like an old English gentleman, by the end of the table. As Chris said, Naz, you bow your head and walk on like the little so-and-so that you are, Max burst out loud, saying, oh, marvellous story, sir, marvellous. So if you ever wondered where the animosity actually stemmed from between Eubank and Naz, well, that was the start of it. Of course, there's more to come. Now, the first fight of the much-vaunted Sky deal was against Mauricio Amaral at the Olympia, West London on the 9th of July, 1994. Amaral was a very tough Brazilian, the Latin American champion, ranked 6th by the WBO and 4th by the WBA, a competent opponent who had won 14 of his 16 pro fights. After the Ray Close fight, Chris didn't have to meet another mandatory challenger for a year, so the Sky deal came at a good time for him. Much was made during the Sky fights of the supposed disparity of pay between Chris's purse and the challengers. For example, for this particular fight, Chris received £750,000 while Amaral got £25,000. Chris felt he was always justified by pointing out that these men he were facing were getting a title shot on still bigger purses than they had ever earned in their careers. The idea is to get the championship, then you make your money, and that's what Chris said he had to do. Amaral was a robust fighter and actually cut Chris's eye in the 7th, leaving him fighting with a stream of blood obscuring his vision. Chris would go on to win the fight via points, but once again incurred the full wrath of a hard-to-please press. They were inevitably some critics who thought Chris had lost, but Amaral was not as inferior as they actually made out. He put up a good fight, and some even suggested he might have won. On the 27th of August, he then took on Irishman Sam Storey at Cardiff Arms Park. This fight saw Chris stop his opponent for the first time in 30 months when his corner threw in the towel in the 7th. He had gone down in an earlier round and hurt his ankle, but Chris psychologically felt that he had too much fear to fight Chris. He went into the ring, and they were both being quite cagey, and then Chris jolted towards him, and he reeled in horror. Chris then knew that this guy's game was up. He was much stronger than him, so he just powered him out of there. Chris did sustain a cut on his eye again, though, which was never welcomed. But that being said, the butterfly stitches that they gave him always looked good. He always liked that. For him, it was a battle scar, and it made him look tough. The Storey fight contained his 300th professional 3-minute round. Despite such a lengthy record, Chris felt he was still phenomenally fit and motivated. The next fight after Story was against American Dan Shoma in South Africa's Sun City. Chris flew in and stayed at the King Suite in the Sun City Palace Hotel complex. The man who developed Sun City, Sol Kerzner, regularly used the room. It was magnificent, Chris said, with a baby grand piano, a sauna, jacuzzi, dining room as well, 2 sitting rooms and incredible views. Chris stayed there for 3 weeks when he was in the country, but when he returned home, he was taken aback, somewhat, by the £30,000 bill. He felt he'd brought media attention and value to Sun City and perhaps should not have had to have paid that much. But, of course, you learn by your mistakes. When he was staying at the luxury suite, he was told that Sting, the singer, wanted the room and that Chris needed to move out. Needless to say, he did. In his head, he thought, "You're Sting. I'm Chris Eubank. You don't have any rights over me." Sting never took any offence, he was just asking the question. Indeed, Chris was later invited to his birthday party at this game reserve. He took him a present of these really splendid army trainers that were very in fashion at the time. Now, although Chris had ample time to hit the weight limit, at one point he was 21 pounds over the allowed mark. Chris worked very hard to get down, training with little or no food. John Regan told him that his skin had turned grey from the drying out. For that fight, Chris had an acute craving for pineapples. The morning of the bout, he actually sat in that suite and juiced 25. Chris said it made him nauseous. It was okay though, there was no harm done. But that being said, this was the first time Ronnie publicly aired his reservations about his weight loss. It never troubled Chris though, despite what people thought. On the actual night, John Regan took his seat, as usual, near the ring while Chris prepared in the dressing room. The cathedral-like venue within Sun City had several tiers, and John has since told Chris that for one of the fighters on the undercard, namely the flyweight, baby Jake Matala, the upper levels were filled with Zulus chanting tribal mantra and stamping the floor in orchestrated union. Chris said that his opponent, Dan Shoma, was a very tough fight. Chris said he got him totally wrong beforehand. Chris marked him only as a 3. And he said he's the only person who, in my opinion, beat me despite the decision going my way. Chris felt he was the aggressor, which is always welcomed by the judges, but he was being picked off. His boxing ability allowed him to do that. He was always just out of range, so when Chris struck, he missed, and Shoma would counter. He hit quite hard too, Chris said, and broke one of his teeth in the early rounds, just like Johnny Melfer had done back in 1989. The tooth was half hanging out and causing Chris great annoyance, so during the next round, Chris said, "I sucked it out of the hole of my gum and spat it onto the canvas." He said it wasn't painful, bear in mind he's being hit with severe venom by a very strong and capable boxer, so a loose tooth, it's the least of his worries. By this time, Chris had a lot of regard for Shoma, because he knew he was technically very able and a skilled fighter. He had successfully disarmed Chris before the fight, and he had not expected such a test. The reason Chris said he was disarmed was because he looked like a pizza chef. When they had walked into the press conference a week or so before the fight, and Chris was looking around the room for his opponent, normally, one fighter knows another fighter without even asking because there's just that certain look in their eyes. The pools of isolation and hardship, it gives them a certain fix, something that you come to recognise. And he looked around this room, and there was nothing. There was no one. He looked again. He turned to Barry Hearn and said, "Is he here, Barry?" "Where is he?" Barry said. Yeah, he's over there." And he pointed at this pizza chef-looking character. Chris couldn't believe his eyes. He was podgy. He had no boxer's poise, and he was just no aura about him. He was just like some mild-mannered man in the street. There was no fix, there was no focus, there was not 1 ounce of threat in his persona. Chris said to himself, this is going to be embarrassing. Well, that assumption very nearly cost Chris dear. His preconception had disarmed him, when in fact, this fighter was a hard, skillful puncher boxer. All the boxers who strutted in looking tough, that was old news. Chris knew who they were. He had their number, but in his entire career he'd never seen this in any other fighter. He was the only one who looked like he flipped pizzas. When he got in there, he still didn't look dangerous, but that's why he picked Chris off left, right and upwards. By the end of round 12, Chris thought he'd lost the fight. In the end, he got the decision and put that down to the aggression. However, he believed a technically accomplished fighter should always be given the benefit of the doubt over a boxer who relies on aggression. Chris considered himself very fortunate on this occasion. The press was saying that Chris's next opponent, Henry Wharton, was a highly talented and capable fighter. His record seemed good enough, 20 wins, 1 draw and a single loss to Nigel Benn. But he'd also put Nigel Benn on the canvas. But Chris was more than happy to take him on. He jokingly called him Easy Lolly. But Chris knew that anyone who had put Nigel Benn on the canvas had to be useful. The fight before, Wharton knocked his opponent's spark out, completely cold, so it was clear he knew his business, and he packed a punch. Before the Henry Wharton contest, promoter Mickey Duff referred to Chris as scum at the pre-fight press conference. Well, that insult gave Chris the opportunity to show his dignity in as much as he got up to leave the room. It was defamation of character, pure and simple. Chris knew that he wasn't scum, and what's more, the public at large knew that too. So Chris read that slur simply as a shallow attempt to antagonise Chris before the fight. Over the years, people obviously stooped to all kinds of levels to try and beat Chris psychologically before a fight, but his opponents only succeeded once. Calling him scum? Well, Chris was a bit more refined and intelligent than that. Was that the best he could think of? Well, that said, in fairness, it did flame the fires of the fight and fuel ticket sales. The thing is with boxing, it's renowned for its Machiavellian tactics outside of the ring. Over the years, Chris had to deal with people who, to put it politely, have unusual ways of doing business. Promoters, of course, are a mixed bunch. For example, he'd said Barry Hearn always did everything with style and charm, whereas most promoters are not like that. When Chris was looking for a promoter to get him the fights he wanted, he went to see most of the big-name men and was often treated with complete disregard. When he first met Mickey Duff, he acted as though Chris should be privileged to be even in his company, talking about all the champions he'd worked with and telling Chris he should be on a winning team. As Chris told the media at the time, that meant nothing to him. What he had done in the past was irrelevant. This wasn't about Mickey Duff, it was about Chris. Another promoter owes him £800 from 1989 over a television rights deal. And that was the nature of the business. Barry Hearn had been very concerned, as indeed were the local police, about the potential for crowd violence at the Wharton fight. A great deal of money was spent on extra policemen and security, with 150 riot officers being posted outside alone. On the night itself, there was also a bomb scare. But Chris wasn't distracted. He entered the arena on a raised platform with fireworks whistling behind him into the air. He was in great shape, and although the British Boxing Board of Control had asked to be allowed unofficial weight checks in the weeks leading up to the bout, Chris was in great condition. He'd prepared for a hard night's work. Wharton's loyal traveller contingent made their dislike for Chris quite well known. It was a packed venue. Apparently even Ryan Giggs couldn't get a ticket. However, Chris was in fine form and disposed of an impressive Henry Wharton with poetic efficiency, albeit in an incredibly tough fight. Chris jabbed relentlessly and closed his eye, which swelled up like a balloon. When they cut his eye open to release the build-up of blood and fluids, a female reporter at ringside fainted. Chris said that Henry Wharton brought the fight to him, and to his immense credit, he used the great strength and persisted and persisted and persisted. However, with the benefit of hindsight, Wharton came in there with almost too much heart because Chris worked around that and used his technical skills to defeat him. If he had pulled back a little bit, reviewed the terrain, strategised perhaps, then maybe he might have had the beating of Chris. The thing is, if you go into a fight with Chris Eubank with such tunnel vision, well, Chris is ready for you. Some have also said that it was a sterling display from Chris. Afterwards, Ronnie, at times his harshest critic, told him that, in his opinion, that was one of his 3 greatest fights. However, even knowing that he'd excelled, that contest was so hard that it almost broke his spirit. After the fight, there was a press conference in which Chris said he sighed deeply, saying, "I can't do this anymore." That was his 43rd professional fight. Chris said that the reason he felt so jaded was the effect on him of Wharton's resolve, his heart. Yeah, Chris had won the fight, and it was a spectacular performance. However, when you're in there, and you hit a guy so heavily and repeatedly, but he just keeps on coming, it's going to eventually break your morale. Chris couldn't stop Wharton. He was like a train, huffing and puffing. He just wouldn't stop coming forward. Before the fight, Chris had given him a 6 for technical ability, which was pretty accurate, but he was easily a 10 for persistence. His spirit was unstoppable. He had nearly broken Chris's spirit with his persistence because Chris had expected to stop someone like that. He'd hit him with some heavy shots, but he just wouldn't stop coming forward. And that's what people want in a fighter. The skills are actually secondary. And the question is, where's your heart? Well, Henry Wharton had a great one. After Henry Wharton, there was some talk of fighting Roy Jones Jr., who had recently disposed of the abrasive American James Toney. For Chris, however, the Sky deal was very much back on track. He'd won much acclaim with that performance against a very capable Henry Wharton, arguably his best display since Ben Watson and Rocky Gianni. He was ready to take on his next challenger, and this particular man Chris had met before. He was given a 4 by Chris, and his name was Steve Collins. Now, at that second Ray Close fight in Belfast, Steve Collins had come into Chris's dressing room and congratulated him on his performance. And as he was leaving, Chris looked at John Regan and said, "Easy money." He was a 6 maximum in Chris's eyes. Of course, it's funny how things work out, isn't it? The first fight against the so-called Celtic warrior Steve Collins was at a tiny village in County Cork at Mill Street. Collins had fought 31 times, 20 of which were in America, so he was obviously going to be of strong resolve. That much Chris knew from his days in New York. However, Chris felt he was a very ordinary fighter who'd been around for years but achieved nothing spectacular. Ronnie, as with Michael Watson, had warned Chris about underestimating him. There was actually an initial postponement before the date was set for the 18th of March 1995. In short, Chris said that Steve Collins made Chris dislike him. His psychological mind game before the first encounter was the only instance in Chris's entire career that he effectively said he lost a fight before he got in the ring. However, it was not, as is widely believed, Collins' talk of supposedly being under hypnosis. Well, that unnerved Chris. The words that most unsettled him were at a pre-fight press conference in Dublin. Collins turned up 1 to 2 hours late, which was an insignificant and old trick to play, and he spoke in Gaelic, which was also transparent and weak. However, then he turned to Chris and said words to the effect of, "You dress like a Brit, speak like a Brit. I've helped the Irish. What have you ever done for your race, the Africans?" That could be taken as a good observation by an uneducated or emotionally unaware person, but it was such a preposterous, ridiculous statement. However, it did make Chris hate him intensely, which is the gravest mistake to make as a boxer. If another man can anger you, he can conquer you. At the moment that question first registered in Chris's mind, Steve Collins had got the better of him. The reason Collins had done this was because Chris instantly disliked him immensely. And once you dislike someone to that degree, you're going to find it very difficult to beat that person because your judgment is clouded, and all you want to do is hurt them. You've allowed yourself to become too subjective. If you anger someone, you'll conquer them. Well, Steve Collins achieved his goal. Chris's wife gave him a quotation from a book she'd been reading called Memoirs of a Geisha, which read thus, "I never seek to defeat the man I am fighting. I seek to defeat his confidence. A mind troubled by doubt cannot focus on the course to victory. Two men are equals, true equals, only when they have both equal confidence." Steve Collins and Chris Eubank didn't have equal confidence. If they would have done, Chris thinks he would have beaten him. Unfortunately, he let Collins get into his head. Well, that famous hypnosis story was secondary to these comments about his ancestors, but also made Chris uneasy. The night before the fight, the journalist John Rawling took Chris to one side and said, "Chris, I think you better listen to this." And he played a radio interview where Collins' hypnotist was saying how his fighter would not get hurt, how he would not bleed, how he would be constant, that he would not feel pain because he is under hypnosis. Well, Chris said it spooked him. When he fought Michael Watson for the second time, he was 3 times the man he was when he fought him a few months earlier. And the thought actually crossed Chris's mind back then that perhaps he actually was under hypnosis. After what had happened on that night with Michael Watson, he wasn't prepared to go in with another fighter who might not have the capability of protecting his own well-being. Chris wasn't ready for that type of fight. He was prepared for an ordinary boxer, so psychologically, Collins had broken into Chris's refuge. Chris said to Barry the night before the fight, "I want to go home. I'm not prepared for another Watson 2. Barry's response, "If you leave now, you lose all your credibility." So Chris took the fight, which, in hindsight, was a mistake. A few months later, Chris said that if Collins was to lose his life in the ring with him, then he could not be held responsible. Chris felt that was a fair observation. The British Boxing Board of Control actually fined Chris £5,000 for saying that. But it made perfect sense to Chris, and still does. His theory was that it is a medical fact that hypnosis can negate physical pain. Therefore, it followed that if Collins was under hypnosis, he would feel no pain and would be reckless towards his own physical well-being. Chris maintains that he was completely in order, but the Board of Control fined him for stating a fact. Of course, what we know now is that Steve Collins faked the whole scenario, but the fact is, at the time, he was playing on what had happened to Michael Watson to unnerve Chris. The final insult came when Steve Collins offered to cover all losing bets from the people who might back Chris Eubank. And it also raises a very key point about boxing, sport in particular, and also life in general. Collins said he faked it and that he would do it again if it meant he would get the decision. To him, it was a win by any means necessary. Chris felt he couldn't win like that. What he did might not be against the rules, but Chris felt it wasn't also noble. On the Tuesday before the fight, Chris was in bed with influenza. At one point, Ronnie thought that they should consider pulling out of the fight. Chris felt like he couldn't do that, like it wasn't an option. On the actual fight night, Chris entered the arena on his Harley Davidson, raised on a crane with fireworks spraying out into a sea of laser lights, possibly the most outrageous entrance of Chris Eubanks ever. Chris was told afterwards that some people saw Collins enter the ring with tears streaming down his face. When Chris got into the ring, he was just sitting still in his corner, eyes closed, listening to the theme tune from Rocky on his personal stereo. Chris doesn't know if that was a ploy to make him think he was indeed hypnotised or not. In a sense, the damage to Chris's equilibrium had already been done before he got in the ring. The huge build-up continued, and there were head counts of 4,000 people at the weigh-in. But after so much hype for the fight itself wasn't a pretty affair. It was more of a mauling, really. A decisive moment came in the 10th when Chris hit him with a straight right hand and poleaxed him. Steve Collins got up, and Chris didn't go forward. He knew at the time that you've always got to go forward and finish the job, but he just stood there. He didn't want what became of Michael Watson to happen again, so he froze. It was never tangibly conscious, but that was the source of Chris's hesitation. He's since learned that if you want to acquire greatness, you can't suffer from the mental anguish when you are going to strike with extreme power. If he had gone forward at that moment, it's likely that he would have stopped Steve Collins. It has been said that one more right probably would have finished the fight. There was talk of a long count, possibly 14 seconds. But, whatever, Chris hadn't moved forward when he needed to. Ronnie slapped him hard at the end of the round, saying, "Finish him off." Well, that mistake cost Chris his title. Many people thought Chris should have got the decision, but he lost. Ronnie felt he'd thrown the fight away for not ending it in that decisive 10th round. In the dressing room afterwards, Chris was very subdued, and he turned to John and said, "Well, it's been a good journey." However, Chris had won 43 fights in a row. 19 of them were world title fights. He had a private plane waiting to take him back home, but Chris kept that waiting at not inconsiderable expense so that he could face the world's media with the dignity a former world champion should have done. Chris had no intention of dodging their questions. He didn't complain. To those who suggested he should have got the decision, he said, "There were decisions in the past that could have gone against me but didn't. So now the rub is against me. So be it. The judges had a job to do, and they did it." The proposition that the Sky deal was just too much to achieve carries only a little weight. Chris took that on in good faith and gave it his very best effort. It was his way of life, and that's how he lived. The problems only started when Collins got inside his head. There was no excuses. Looking back on that night, Chris should have pulled out of the fight. He had his reasons, and they were sound ones. He should have gone home and not fought him, because he wasn't prepared for that type of fight. However, he did fight him, and he did lose the decision. And Chris says that he is accepting of that outcome. The Sky contract that Chris was in allowed him to have 2 10-round non-title fights before being put forward for a fresh title challenge. He was lined up against Bruno Godjov on the 27th of May in Belfast, and he took him out in a round. He comprehensively outclassed him, and the referee stopped the fight. His purse was halved for this one and the next fight, so he was bringing in around £350,000 for those 10-rounders. Pretty good going, really. Next up was Jose Barantanemba in Whitley Bay, and he lasted only 55 seconds before Chris caught him and switched out the lights. When he knocked him out, you almost see it ripple and course through the guy's body as it wreaked havoc with his nervous system. Within 6 months of his first loss, he was scheduled to meet Collins again to try and win back that title. Although Chris's relationship with Barry Hearn had been very enjoyable and mutually beneficial, after the Collins fight, he decided that he could no longer work with him anymore. Essentially, the reason for the disagreement was for the Sky deal. Barry said the £6 million basic package could be supplemented by additional gate receipts. Chris said, "This Sky deal is so good that you should take 25%. Barry said he'd be happy with 12.5%, but Chris insisted. He felt strongly about it. By the fourth fight of the deal, the one against Henry Wharton, Chris thought that the gate receipts should have been greater, so he suggested Barry should take a 12.5% cut rather than the 25%. Chris had initially insisted upon, but Barry said, "These fights are not making enough money. There was no extra to be made yet." If you watch the Collins fight, you can sense that Chris is having problems with Barry. He was hardly looking at him. You could see from the fight interview that the relationship was pretty much at an end. Chris made his decision and told Barry, saying, "I can't work with you unless you go back to 12.5% now because the additional receipts are not coming in as expected." And he said, "I can't do that. I have this company to run and I have people to look after." Chris's response, "Sorry, Barry, then we can't work together anymore." They shook hands and parted as friends. It was a shame because before the fallout, the relationship was pretty much a match made in heaven. Barry has said really good things about Chris. For instance, Eubank certainly changed the face of boxing as we know it. Chris felt like there's nobody straighter than Barry Hearn. You might not have agreed with him, but he was his old man throughout, and the respect that Chris has for him and still has for him has never diminished to this day. Chris said he enjoyed his time with him and wouldn't swap a moment. He's still extremely fond of Barry. He says he was class and he always smiles even though he felt he took money from him. Now, before the second Collins fight, Chris said he trained exceptionally hard. The arena in Cork for the bout was open air, which was a little strange as it was during a very wet spell of weather. During the evening, it was raining so hard, so much that John Regan was putting carrier bags over his shoes to keep the water out as he went to take his seat for the fight. In the second fight, Steve Collins had a resolve, the like of which Chris said he'd never seen. It was just pure desire. It seemed tense, perhaps even uncertain in the press conferences beforehand, but in the ring the aura was nowhere to be seen. His motivation was so immense that Chris was taken aback. He didn't think that Collins had that type of resolve in him. In the 7th round of the fight, Chris cut Collins' eye, but it just seemed to spur him on, especially when the referee took a look at the gash. Collins' resolve was maniacal, and despite Chris's best intentions and meticulous preparations, he couldn't wrestle the crown back from him. This time, unlike the underhand first victory over him, Collins beat him fairly and squarely. Barry later told Chris that he watched the fight on television with tears in his eyes. Ironically, in the dressing room after the second defeat, Chris was surprisingly philosophical. This time he wasn't even as disappointed as after the first fight. He was understanding of the events of life. It was due to happen after so many victories and so many title defences. Having been a professional boxer for 11 years, winning and losing is just part of life, and Chris, in his mind, just lost. After the Collins rematch, Chris announced his retirement. It was essentially his knee-jerk reaction to not prizing the title back. At the time, Chris fully believed that his decision was going to be final. He called a press conference at his Hove home and invited members of the media down. And before he started to speak, they held a 1-minute silence in memory of Jim Murray, the Scottish bantamweight who had unfortunately died the week before, only aged 25. Chris felt like he had to make some great gesture for him to further highlight the plight of boxers. But what's a minute's silence when a man's lost his life? As Chris said, genuinely, he believed his time was done. However, as time went on, it became apparent to him that he still had things to achieve in the business. When he analysed his career, he could see various landmarks that feature in what he felt could be the perfect career. And the first thing you have to do is you have to learn the art, and then you have to apply the philosophy, which is consideration. So, then, you make the money. With the money and the victories comes the fame. Then if you've shown yourself to be a warrior of integrity through all of the steps, you can earn that respect. Chris knew the art and philosophy intimately. He'd earned his money, and he'd earned his fame, and he'd even been of some of the most revered fights in the history of boxing. However, in his mind, he still didn't have that respect that he wanted. It was so elusive because it was a business that is made out to be a thug's game. It obviously isn't, and Chris and many others are proof of that. The odd and confusing thing about earning respect in the business is the fact that to have the ability and talent amounts to only 33% of what it takes to acquire respect. Another 33% is about being able to take and accept a severe beating when a fight is going against you, and 34% is about being dignified. The equation, well, it isn't just a rule, it's just an observation. Despite everything Chris had said and done outside of the ring, so many people still saw him as an oddball or a provocative, which Chris states he wasn't trying to be. And the truth is, the standards were low, and anything which he dignifies goes well over the head of some of the media. People would walk up to Chris in the street and say, "How can you do that for a living?" That's usually a person who worked for someone else for 50 years only to be told goodbye. So Chris's thoughts were always, how can you do that for a living? Chris gradually realised that he had to attain this respect before he could retire. Otherwise, there would always be this sense of unfinished business. He started to become anxious and contemplate winning a title again. Basically, for him, it was actually the wrong time to retire. The decision that led Chris back to the boxing ring was when he was approached by businessmen from the Middle East with a proposal to stage the first ever professional bout in Egypt. The fight, which Chris promoted himself and dubbed the Lord of the Manor presents Style on the Nile, was against a reasonably competent fighter named Luis Barrera. The press made much of him being a poor standard, but the British Boxing Board of Control was fully involved. It was not as if Chris had gone to Cairo and picked anybody off the street corner. Obviously, it wasn't a Nigel Benn, but neither was it a foregone conclusion that he was going to win the fight. Obviously, Barrera was a certain type of calibre. Training for the fight in Egypt, Chris said, was very hard but an interesting experience. He said, "Generally, I was treated with first-class hospitality. I was considered a kidnap risk, so everywhere I went, I was shadowed by these enormous bodyguards with what seemed like enough armoury for a small Middle Eastern country each. This one particular bodyguard was a man mountain and seemed to have absolutely no sense of humour or light-heartedness whatsoever. He was hard work. He was a national basketball player, about 7 feet tall and incredibly surly. He had this bruise on his head, and when I asked him how he got it, he said it was when they bowed in prayer. At one press conference, I pointed out all these pictures of various dignitaries on the wall, and he just looked displeased and said, I killed them. When we took a trip to the pyramids, he took me to one side just before I took this camel ride and said, any trouble? I killed them, and pulled up his trouser leg to reveal an enormous machete. One day, we went to the gym in no particular emergency, but I was given a full lights flashing, sirens blaring, 3-car Chevrolet through town. At one point, there was some overtaking on the wrong side of the road as we went, causing one old car to crash into a fruit stall. I used to drive to gyms in the UK in a Rolls Royce sometimes, but even that had been upstaged by this. For Chris, this was an exhausting time because he was self-promoting and he was training, he was acclimatising, trying to avoid illness, so it was a difficult time, but he did say he had an enjoyable time away from the workload. They were told never to drink water, but he actually made the mistake of having a salad, which of course had been washed with local water. He got up the next morning and met the 2 bodyguards who went everywhere with him, so they could escort him to a car. They drove out of town and began the morning's run, flanked by the men and followed by a 2-car motorcade. Chris started jogging in the searing heat, but after only 2 miles, he had a sudden, uncomfortable rumble in his bowels, his left eyebrow raised as he realised what's going to happen next. Another seismic rumble, and his right eyebrow raised. Well, now we have a situation on our hands, he said. He grabbed his stomach, dived into the back of the car and shouted, "Hotel! Hotel!" They flew through the town, blaring the way past ancient markets, flying past donkey-driven carts and screeched up to the hotel reception. Chris, by this point, was really struggling, so he jumped out of the car, sprinted through the foyer, but the lift was on the top floor. He couldn't afford to wait, so he dashed up the staircase, fumbled for his keys, stomach resounding like a pained hippo, pushed the door open and ran to the bathroom. Well, the fight itself was in a very big local stadium, which had been originally built for the African Games. By the time Chris entered the arena, there were 16,000 people waiting. The UK press said it was all army personnel, but as the army had been helping so much with the organisation, there were troops watching. Ringside seats were £1,000 and there were these plush armchairs. These were perhaps not surprisingly filled by extremely rich-looking men in traditional robes. Richard Furlong did the comparing and had learned an introduction in Arabic, which was well received. The bout itself, well, it was a relatively comfortable win for Chris. He disposed of Barrera in 5 rounds. After the fight, the cynical UK press said that Chris had proved nothing. Chris had worked so hard to push that bout through, promoting ceaselessly as well as training, but the press just totally dismissed it. The fact that this was the first ever professional bout in that country, well, he'd introduced top-level boxing to the Middle East, and he said it's something he's very proud of. When you think about the landscape of boxing now and the involvement of Middle Eastern countries, well, Chris Eubank was one of the first. The next stop on the Middle Eastern tour for Chris was Dubai, part of the United Arab Emirates, and it was for a fight against Camilo Alcaron on the 27th of March 1997. Now, in London before the fight, some of the people involved in the promotion were in a bar with Chris, and Chris was buying people drinks. He offered to buy John Regan a £148 per glass brandy from 1847, and after much persuasion, John graciously accepted. He didn't notice, but John later told him that one of the Middle Eastern entourage was knocking back the brandies, which Chris was paying for, like it was orange juice. While he was out in Dubai, Chris bought one of those enormous Hummer trucks in which he wanted to make his grand Hollywood-style entrance to the fight. However, it was so big that when they got to the stadium, it wouldn't fit through the gates of the Dubai Tennis Club. The fight against Alcaron was over by round 4, but what Dubai was most notable for was a major conflict with Ronnie Davis that was to test the professional relationship of 10 years standing. Now, while they were preparing in Dubai, a situation had erupted with Ronnie that left Chris feeling bitterly disappointed. And the initial impetus for this was a disagreement that they'd had over training, but there were also other underlying issues. Chris was adamant, but Ronnie argued with him. And for Chris, that was that. The way Chris saw it at the time was that he run his own business, and he always did, whereas Ronnie worked for him, whether he liked it or not. But Ronnie has this old-style manager's approach of saying to a fighter, "You stay with me, you'll be all right." Chris used to think, "No, you should make sure you are okay with me. You work for me. You follow the rules and directions that I give you. This is my business, not yours." So the relationship came to a stop. Chris, of course, was very disappointed with him at the time, but the disagreement they had was in part due to the risk that Chris was taking, having no contracts with Sheikh Hamdan, who had appointed a Maser Al-Fayaghi to help coordinate the promotion. In Chris's opinion, Al-Fayaghi in fact did very little to help Chris promote the show, and Ronnie, who knew they were promoting in the dark, had reservations about the whole affair. Chris fixed his focus on training and promoting the boxing match, paid for all the fighters to come and fight, which included flights for the fighters and trainers, doctors and matchmakers, the British Boxing Board of Control officials, hotels, purses for the fighters, and food. Chris took care of everything to achieve the objective of keeping that card on. The promotion took place at the Dubai Tennis Stadium, and it was a complete success, Chris said, if not financially for him. So after his little Middle Eastern jaunt 2 fights down the line, it's September 1997, and Chris announces a new package of fights with Frank Warren in Piccadilly Circus, with his truck in tow. Now, although Chris and Frank Warren had their differences in the past, Chris felt like he needed to get the fights that he wanted, and Frank Warren was the promoter who could do that at the time. And Chris had a new, more relaxed attitude, and he made it clear that he was going to enjoy himself. Last time he didn't stop to smell the flowers, he told the intrigued British public. On reflection, the only reason he might have ever said he hated boxing was because he was doing too much of it. It becomes pretty extreme when you're getting a torrent of criticism for doing a very hard job, and no one really seems to understand you or like you, and the media just misrepresent and can ridicule you as a fighter. So how could Chris like that? All he was doing was getting material trappings, but no acceptance, no credit at all for what he was doing. He didn't hate it. He had a fantastic time, he said. He was just too immersed in the events to enjoy himself. Plus, he shouldn't have used the word hate, and that was just his exasperation of how much negativity was coming towards him from the media and the way they pigeonholed him with his stereotype. So he distanced himself from it. But if you really understand the nobility of it, then Chris would tell you the truth, and he loved it, and he was in love with the sport of boxing. So, we move to October 1997, and there is an exceptionally skilled fighter by the name of Joe Calzaghe, who was due to fight Steve Collins, but as a result of Steve Collins pulling out, Chris Eubank took the fight on 11 days' notice. Now, despite Calzaghe's impressive reputation, Chris said he was prepared to enter the ring with him with less preparation than would be ideal for such a contest. At the time, Chris had been training for a fight against the undefeated Londoner Mark Prince for the WBO Intercontinental Light Heavyweight belt. Consequently, he'd been using sparring partners that matched his style and bigger size, but that didn't deter Chris from accepting the Calzaghe fight. It was an opportunity to regain the WBO super middleweight title, so Chris was keen to accept the gauntlet that had been thrown his way. Indeed, he said at the time it was like winning the lottery just to get the shot. He looked at Calzaghe's record, unbeaten in 22 fights, with 10 first-round knockouts and 21 early finishes in all. He was also a 3-time amateur national schoolboy champion and a triple ABA champion. Obviously, he could box and he could punch, but Chris wondered if he had ever fought anyone of pedigree yet. After all, Chris had been in 21 world title fights at this point. Even though he was always in superb condition, to accept the bout was nonetheless a brave decision, but one that Ronnie probably would have advised against if he'd still been with Chris at the time. Chris did acknowledge that he was worried about certain aspects of the fight, probably the first time in his career that he actually used that word. But that being said, he was much more relaxed around the boxing business at this point, and he even told the press he was having fun. The choice was brave. His next decision, though, was unwise. He'd been having knee problems and using the VersaClimber as he couldn't run on the road. Although, obviously, roadwork is the ideal stamina conditioner, the VersaClimber was helpful. Nonetheless, Chris was concerned that the knee would play up on the night, especially if you recall the emphasis that Chris's style placed on multi-directional foot movements. Half an hour before the Calzaghe fight, Chris got permission from the doctor to have an injection to assist his knee joints. The morning after the contest, he couldn't walk because his knees had seized up. The Harley Street doctor said he'd just maxed the pain and worn down the ligaments in the knee. He gave himself a future physical problem right there and then. The pre-fight work continued to be somewhat belligerent when Chris's helicopter to the Sheffield press conference was stranded at Gatwick because of high winds. Fortunately, Chris's weight loss program was carefully overseen by his wife Karen, who put him on a liquidized fruit and vegetable diet that worked miracles. He weighed in 4 ounces inside the 12-stone limit, although he had to take off 2 pairs of thick socks and a t-shirt to finally nail the weight. The fight was at the Sheffield Arena, and Prince Naseem was on the same bill, so there was some fanning of the old flames of animosity that people felt existed between the two of them. The take here was that the old master upstaging the new champion in his hometown, but Chris wasn't really interested in all of that. It was just publicity talk. Sky moved Chris's fight until after Nazi's bout, so the way Chris looks at it is maybe they felt like the Eubank-Calzaghe fight was a bigger attraction than Nazi's fight. Chris came out of his corner for the first round smiling. He was moving around and sizing up the terrain, when boom, Calzaghe hit him with a huge shot that literally came out of nowhere and knocked Chris down. Chris said he simply didn't see the punch coming. A first-round knockdown had never happened to Chris up until this point of his career. He picked himself up from the canvas and brushed himself down. And he thought to himself, "You've got your work cut out tonight, guy." Chris's constitution, though, was strong enough to soak up the damage that the punch might have done in the longer term. So once he'd regained his poise, he thought to himself, I'll knock on your door in the 10-4-11th round, but boy, I'm going to have to take some stick in the meantime. Chris had no problem with being in the trenches for a while. After all, in some fights, not least the second Watson fight, he'd lived in there permanently. Calzaghe had very fast hands and an awkward southpaw style, so he proved to be quite a handful. Chris knew how to absorb the punishment, take it and give it back. But to his credit, Calzaghe stayed there until the final bell and took a unanimous decision. That was despite Chris's promised late attack, which nearly knocked Calzaghe out in the final seconds of the bout. After the fight, he went to Joe and complimented him on his performance and made no excuse in the press interviews. In return, the media spoke very kindly about Chris, which, of course, was very welcomed. Steve Bunce, at the time of the Daily Telegraph, said the bout was quite simply one of the finest fights in British boxing history. After a career of being almost universally berated, well, such appreciative words were warmly received by Chris Eubank. Chris was sitting in the bathroom of his dressing room after the fight, quite deflated. The eminent businessmen Rory McCarthy and Richard Branson came into the room, and Chris was talking to them, saying, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. Richard Branson said to him, I can't believe how valiant you were in there. You've inspired the whole country. At that point, Chris was buoyed by Richard Branson's comment, but he still couldn't envisage a return match. Calzaghe was undoubtedly a good fighter, but he struggled to showcase his box office, which was always going to hold him back. Unfortunately, the nature of the modern game demands that to be gifted, disciplined and technically skilled is not always necessarily enough. You've got to have the character, charisma and personality as well. Boxing skills will get you talked about in the boxing press, but the charisma will make your box office and get you on the front pages. It was notable that the fighting public did not appreciate Naz's apparent arrogance after his own victory that night. Ironically, in the wake of Chris's defeat and brave and gracious acceptance of the loss, the British public warmed to Chris like they'd never done before. Friedrich Nietzsche said, the only way to know a true man's value is his capacity for sticking to his guns. When asked if Chris was going to retire at this point, he said, life is a show, and the show must go on. One of the things about Chris Eubank's career is about certain fighters that he never fought. There were certain fighters that many people felt he dodged during the 90s. And there's a really good extract out of his book where I've put into the story for you guys to hear his perspective about. And he said, dodging a fighter is a cardinal sin in boxing and is something he can never be accused of, unlike one such character who came on the scene at the end of his era. Roy Jones, James Toney and Michael Nunn, for example. Chris said he didn't dodge them. So he said, let's use Roy Jones as an example. When people ask me why I wouldn't fight him, I would say to them, never mind the title or my job, a fight like that can take 5 or 6 years off my life. I was well aware of that. He was pound for pound arguably the best fighter on the planet in regards to his style, his devastating punching power, and the whole repertoire. Well, he had it. The rule is that if you're champion of the world for one body, you can't be the number one contender for another belt. Unless someone was officially the recognised number one contender, Chris had no professional obligation to face them. Now with Roy Jones, for Chris he was fortunately never number one contender. Had he been, Chris said he would never have dodged the fight. He would have taken the fight. Would he have won the fight? Well, he admits, highly unlikely. Chris also said, what would have been for sure was that he would have come away from the fight and got hurt. And I would have been hurt probably far more than he was. It would have been a war. Technically, we would have been well matched, so our pure grit would have started to come into play. I believe we both had powerful wills, so I feel that fight would have ended up running on pure instinct. That can be an exceptionally violent occurrence. Interestingly, I was told that Roy Jones was rumoured to have said that the only fighter he had reservations about facing was me. I don't remember my critics saying much about that. One fighter that Chris was relieved never to see as the number one contender was the highly skillful Harold Bomber Graham. Chris made it quite clear at the time what he thought of his gift. That fight would never have happened unless he was number one contender, in which case Chris couldn't dodge. McCallum and Nunn were quality fighters, but not like Harold Graham. You couldn't hit him. He was so elusive. They said in the business, you couldn't hit him with a handful of stones. Chris said that was true. He was a grandmaster. Chris also said, the ultimate measure of a fighter is not dodging. If you do, you lose your standing, your respect, your honour. Don't dodge the number one contender. So, I'm going to move on to a story, quite a famous Chris Eubank story, and one I've seen him do recently for his YouTube channel. Very, very funny story, and I could not help but get this in there for you guys. So, there was one day in London, he was there for business, and he took his truck with him. He often stayed at the Landmark Hotel near Baker Street and usually parks the truck at the back of the building, where they've got allocated spaces for coaches. Well, there was this one particular day. There were a lot of guests, so the coach park was full, meaning that he had to find a space for his truck in a side road. The morning after, he had his breakfast and he took a stroll to check up on the truck. When he got there, someone had smashed the window, broken in, and taken the television and video that he had in the cabin. Well, that was fine. He accepted that. Chris said, don't get me wrong, I'd rather it hadn't happened, but I understand that. Some people obviously steal for money, some for valuables, and Chris, given his former life, and as we talked about in part 1, you can kind of understand where they're coming from. He still doesn't make it right. However, as he was rummaging around the cabin, checking what was missing from the truck, he made what he described as a chilling discovery. They had taken his strawberry bonbons from the glove compartment. Chris said, don't touch a man's strawberry bonbons. You just don't do that. It is against the rules. Being as passionate as I am about strawberry bonbons, I had kept them in the glove compartment for about 3 months, gently maturing. They had ripened beautifully to the point where they were deliciously soft in the middle. Something that can only be achieved with careful and experienced fermentation within a glove compartment. This process can't be rushed. They need to be aged gracefully. What was even more disturbing was that I thought I also had some blackjacks in there too. I acknowledge that the world is split on this particular chewy sensation. It is common knowledge that they make your teeth go black. However, they're so addictive, so sublime. I wasn't certain there had been some blackjacks in the truck, so I preferred not to think about it, because if they'd taken my blackjacks as well, then that just would have been too much to handle. They must have been desperate men. There is a code of conduct and honour amongst thieves. Don't touch the strawberry bonbons. As for blackjacks, don't even think about it. Chris called BBC Radio 1 and actually said he wanted to report the theft. Well, on a serious note, he was glad of the opportunity to again make his point that although he understood people stealing material goods, if you hurt someone in the process, you've got to face the severe consequences. He reiterated that material goods can be replaced, but you can't replace strawberry bonbons that have been aged to perfection in a glove compartment for 3 months. Chris said he also told the police about his strawberry bonbons, but they were never recovered. So, back to his career. And Carl Thompson was marked on Chris's list as a 7 out of 10. He said that Carl had true grit, but he wasn't in the same technical league as Chris. He never had Chris's ability or talent, but he had that resolve, and he was a heavier fighter. He was lined up to fight him on the April 18th, 1998 at the Manchester 9X Arena for the WBO Cruiserweight title, 2 divisions above his usual weight. The limit was 13 stone 8, and Chris weighed in 18 pounds heavier than for the Joe Calzaghe fight. The press conferences were amicable affairs, with Chris attending in a straw boater on the HMS Belfast on the River Thames. Thompson and Chris wanted a better purse. Chris knew that Thompson was box office, so he said to one businessman, "Let's do the coin thing." Businessman replied, "What do you mean?" Chris closed the door on the journalist and replied, "I'll flip a coin. £50,000 a time." At the time, Chris's friend Doctor was with him, and the businessman agreed, so they started flipping this coin. And Chris was on a roll, and he quickly had him up to a debt of £350,000. It eventually came back down to £150,000, at which point Chris wanted out. He never saw a penny, and Chris maintains that the businessman still owes him that debt. So Chris fought Carl the Cat Thompson in a fight billed as Double Trouble. Carl was a big man and a former kickboxing champion. Now, although you might think that the luxury of not having to strip the weight down would be welcome, Chris said it wasn't. For years, he had eaten only once a day, and not in any great quantity. Even then, Here he was being asked to eat 3 big meals a day, and he didn't enjoy that at all, he said. The fight was the first and only time in his career that he did not vault into the ring as well. He stood by the ropes and waited for the anticipation to build, then just calmly stepped under the ropes. Mainly, he still had an issue with those knees, and he didn't want to damage them before he'd even started boxing. He would never have them injected again, so he needed to make sure they were taken care of. Plus, he felt he didn't need to put on so much of a show. He felt, well, I am who I am. He was always a showman, but that night, the vault was not something he felt he needed anymore. He was later told that George Foreman was cheering him on at ringside, which he said was a great honour. Also, Maximo Perez was in Chris's corner, which was also a big boost. He was his mentor, and Chris still wanted to please him more than anybody else. Just as all those years ago in Jerome Gym in New York, if he said "espresso," that recognition meant everything to Chris. Now, despite the weight advantage, Thompson held. Chris was quickly on top, and it was quite a brutal bout. At one point, Chris almost had to be pushed off his stool to start the next round. Such was the sapping ferocity of some of the exchanges between the two men. By the 5th, Chris dropped him, and he troubled him again in the 7th, but like in the first Collins fight, Chris didn't finish the job. He said afterwards, the puppeteer stopped working the puppet. It cost Chris dearly. The decision went against him, and he couldn't see that. Yeah, his eye was severely swollen and bleeding, but that was the only damage that he'd sustained. He actually felt he won that fight. Chris was absolutely perplexed when they went on to name Thompson as Fighter of the Year, even after the defeat. Thompson was still a 7, but he stayed in there, and Chris gives him much credit for that. Chris was hospitalised at the Manchester Royal Infirmary for nearly 48 hours for observation and treatment on his severely damaged eye. However, when they discharged Chris, they had a limo pick him up and headed home. The next day, Chris said he felt very different. He watched the fight on tape, and that reinforced his gut feeling on the night, which was that he'd won. He had to try and get that title. The rematch was arranged for only 12 weeks later, a quick return, about which there was a great deal of consternation within the business. Observers said this was with undue haste, particularly in light of the brutality of the first fight, which some had likened to the first Nigel Benn fight. However, precautions were taken, such as the British Boxing Board of Control giving Chris 2 brain scans, which came up perfectly clear. There were so many people that warned him off that second Thompson fight because his eye had not properly healed, but Chris wasn't interested in heeding those warnings. In the press conferences for the rematch, Chris called his still visibly bruised eye his badge of honour, a proud battle scar. Chris's face, remarkably, was unmarked for a veteran of 52 professional fights, which some say is a tribute to Chris's defensive capabilities. However, Chris enjoyed having this scar. As for putting him off a rematch, he didn't even hear the reservations, he just wanted that title. He had a meeting arranged at Terminal 3 of Heathrow Airport with a known promoter before the second Thompson fight. Chris was not aware that when he got there, Prince Naseem Hamed would be present, having his business to attend to. At this time, they still weren't talking. He'd seen him previously at the Queen's Honours Party, and such was his refusal to make contact, he lifted his nose in the air when Naz came over to say hello. Chris had ignored him for 4 years. He didn't exist to Chris because it was unacceptable what he'd previously done. So at Heathrow, Chris was walking a short distance in front of Naseem Hamed when he heard him say, "Chris, do you want to look at my belts? Hey, Chris." Now bear in mind, Chris had just failed to take the belt in the Thompson fight, so he knew exactly what a disrespect that this was from Naseem Hamed. "Hey, Chris, do you want to look at my belts?" Chris ignored his comments, which he just kept on repeating. But then Chris heard the word wanker. Chris stopped in his tracks. For Chris, this was bullying. Of course, having the childhood that Chris had had, he knew that if a bully punches you, you have to punch him back. That was the only way that he was going to earn respect. So he turned around and he walked up to Naseem Hamed so that they were no more than 12 inches apart. A standoff. He took his belts off him and threw him across the floor. He looked down at him and said, "Listen, you little shit, what are you doing? You should practice a little more respect." His bodyguards were all closing in around Chris at this point because he was alone, and a crowd had gathered for what probably was one hell of an intriguing sight. Chris pulled his hand open way back and slowly made as if to slap Prince Naseem Hamed for the disrespect he shown. Now, in boxing circles, such a slow telegraph move is obviously not with actual intent to make contact. It was more of a gesture to say, this is what your behaviour deserves. Don't bully me verbally and don't behave like a child. However, despite the blatantly slow open palm that Chris was showing him, Naz moved out of the way and threw an open-handed punch whereby the top knuckle of his little finger clipped Chris's nose. In any circles, let alone professional boxing terms, this was just completely disrespectful. Bear in mind that Chris was only a few inches from him, and he is much smaller and lighter than Chris, and if Chris had retaliated with a jab, he probably would have been unable to evade. It would, quite frankly, have been a very damaging moment. If Chris would have dropped him, it could have been very nasty, and if he'd been the type to not control his impulses, well, who knows what would have happened. Chris was just dismayed at the behaviour though. Like, first he's being taunted and now he lays a finger on him. At that moment, knowing how much emphasis Chris placed on personal conduct and integrity with regards to a fighter's success, he said to himself, here is a person who cannot have a fighter's heart. I am an older man. I have set the course which people like Naz have followed. The reason why fighters like Naseem make the vast sums of money they do now is because of boxers like myself who opened the floodgates. However, I'm struck by his lack of respect for me. Even when I cannot abide by something one has done, rather than abuse them, I just ignore them. I just thought, what are you doing? We're not in the playground. We're not 7-year-olds. At the time of the airport scene, it was well known in the business that Naz was strongly religious. Yet, Chris didn't see how that behaviour fitted in with his faith as a Muslim. Chris tried to think why Naz was behaving like it. Was it jealousy? Was it envy? Ignorance? Or perhaps just pure childish behaviour? Either way, it was one of the moments in British boxing history that lives in infamy because of the way Naz was trying to treat Chris Eubank at the time. And it was a big deal back in that period of time. Ultimately, Naz obviously would go on and lose to Marco Antonio Barrera and get his humbling as time would go on, of course. But for Chris, this was a pivotal moment in terms of his relationship in the boxing world. Moving back to the boxing, and the second Thompson fight was on 18th of July at the Sheffield Arena and would be Chris's last professional fight. He trained for this fight at the isolated Hunchjas camp near Bodmin Moor, which is owned by a man of respect, Terry Johnson. He invited the press down to see him work and enjoyed the distance that it gave him from all the distractions of his normal life. He even invited youngsters to watch him train in order to complete his community service from a fireworks incident that happened outside of the ring. The camp is in a valley, so there was no mobile phone signal at all, and each night they would walk up to the top of the hill and phone his wife and catch up on the day's news surrounded by sheep and the smell of manure. Some nights he was sure that the sheep were calling his name. Distractions and boxing, well, it's like oil and water. You need focus. And that place gave him the isolation because there was nothing to do except train, play dominoes, eat food and be around Terry, who was a good soul to be near. The last time Chris had trained away from his family had been against the veteran John Jarvis, whom he stopped in 3 rounds, so he felt this was worth the suffering. He also sparred with Dennis Andrews, the former veteran light heavyweight champion of the world, to get his strength boosted even more. Chris felt what was a shame going into the second Thompson fight was that Thompson had said Chris was brilliant in the first fight, but this time, in the build-up for the second, he was more antagonistic towards Chris, so the amicable atmosphere of the previous clash had completely dissipated. Some insiders said this was because, although he won the first bout, Chris won all of the plaudits and acclaim. One headline had shouted, "Simply the bravest." The fight itself was being beamed across to the United States on ESPN, so the potential stakes for the winner, well, they were quite high. The crowd reception for Chris was very warm, and it brought tears to his eyes. It was so different for Chris to enter an arena and have thousands of people chanting Eubank. This time, despite the brief spell since the last fight, Chris was really on form. He outboxed, outclassed, and outfought Thompson. But Chris said once again the weight advantage was a burden. But he could handle. After all that, the punches were quite easy to absorb compared to the bombs that he'd taken in his career, not least from Nigel Benn. Chris felt, as he'd said previously, that he'd won the first encounter, but during this second fight, Chris was without a doubt the better fighter. If it had gone to points, there was no way that Carl Thompson would have won. The first 6 rounds, Chris boxed very well, something that was widely acknowledged after the fight. However, by round 9, Chris's left eye had swollen badly and nearly closed after continual jabbing from Thompson. Chris, in hindsight, accepted that maybe the eye had not had enough time to recover from the previous bout, and he asked his corner to cut the eye in order to release the build-up of fluids from the swelling. But the corner wouldn't do it. He hadn't worked with this particular cornerman before. It was supposed to be good, but he wouldn't cut the eye. It was only water, and in Chris's words, his health, well, in his eyes, came second. He never knew it was actually illegal to slit your own eye. He just wanted to win the fight. Slit the eye, and I'll win, he said. In the corner, the doctor came to look at Chris and would not allow Chris to come out for the 10th round. He was amazed and bitterly disappointed. Even if he'd lost the last 3 rounds, he would still have won the fight comfortably on points. The shut eye partly incapacitated Chris, and of course you can't see particular punches coming, but he felt he was way ahead on all 3 judges' scorecards. He felt the doctor was disrespectful to him as well, because any fighter who is ahead on points, well, they deserve at least one more round regardless of the circumstances. Chris had been a world champion, a fighter of genuine worth, so as courtesy he thought he should have been given at least that one more round before the fight was stopped. When Julian Jackson was fighting Harold Graham, Chris heard the referee tell Jackson he had 3 more minutes and then it was over. And of course Jackson went on to knock Graham out with a great punch, and it was a huge upset. However, this particular doctor on this night wouldn't let Chris out, despite Chris putting his arm around him and pleading with him to let him go out for the next round. Of course, you're open to interpretation as to how and why that didn't happen. Some people have suggested that certain parties at the time wanted to take Chris down a peg or 2, but he still feels he should have been let out for another round. And this is what Chris had to say about it all. He said, "You couldn't even take me down a peg by this point in my career. This is about integrity. I had a true heart through all 392 professional rounds I contested. In the wake of the second Thompson fight, the British public warmed to me in a way that they'd never done when I was champion for 5 years. Those 2 cruiserweight fights, plus the battle I lost to Joe Calzaghe, had won me the respect I had been seeking when I came out from my first premature retirement. Losing with grace and dignity in those final 3 fights showed my absolute integrity. Although I had taken severe punishment from Ben and Watson, the public did not perceive that I had taken my beating, because I went on to win. People wanted to see how I lost, as well as how I took victory. This isn't just a British trait. In order to give you their lasting respect, the public need to see that you can stay the course. I had showed my grit through thick and thin, when times were good and bad. That Eubank always strutted when he was winning. Let's see what he's made of now. How did he lose? Like a man, with dignity? Well, yes, then he's the complete package. When Chris hit the canvas in the Calzaghe fight, for example, the crowd, who had bayed for his blood, were shouting, "No, Eubank, get up, Eubank." They'd misjudged him. Whenever he was getting beaten up in the ring, Chris could have easily pretended that he'd twisted his ankle, as some fighters do to get themselves out of there. He could have taken a shot and stayed down. It probably would have made his life easier. But his concern was not the public who had seen him quit. His concern was that he had to live with that. He could never have done that. That misjudgment, mainly by the press, gave Chris the opportunity to entertain the public, for which he's very grateful for. However, now they've discovered Chris's true worth, that he was never a pretender, that he was actually a hero. Well, at this point, Chris's professional boxing career was over. He knew when he went into the ring for the second time against Carl Thompson that it was all or nothing. It was win or bust, his last hurrah. As soon as that doctor stopped Chris for going out for the 10th, he knew, without even thinking that it was all over. Afterwards, he asked what the British public thought he should do in a phone poll. But in his heart, he knew that the time had finally come to call it a day. Chris said his dignity demanded it. People have asked Chris if he regrets taking on such a heavier man. He said of course he doesn't. He often sparred with much heavier men, and that considerable weight difference was of no consequence to him, other than making him work harder. The Thompson fights were absolutely central to the public reception of Chris at the time, the media's view of his career, and perhaps most importantly, to his own integrity. Chris said, "Sometimes you are beaten by a fighter, but you have not actually lost. By that, I mean you feel you lost the battle, but in losing the battle, you win the war." Chris's boxing journey, had officially come to an end. And people often ask Chris Eubank if he missed boxing, and his response was, in short, no. It's a relief in many ways to be retired. The lifestyle was so Spartan, so lonely, so demanding, and contained such hardship, it is hard to miss. If you should leave your partner, you will not miss them because the time spent with that person is over for you. If your partner should leave you, then you will naturally want them back. You will miss that relationship. And yet, it is true that there is an intangible pull that tries to seduce you back into the ring. When I retired after the second Thompson fight, that was it. Finished. However, one of the cleverest things I've done in the last few years is to start smoking cigars and inhaling. Why is that clever, you ask? It's clever because boxing is a far bigger evil than cigars. If you carry on too long in the business of boxing, forget about your health, forget about your damaged knees or potential head injury, you are likely to lose your dignity. If I had depended on my discipline to keep me away from boxing, I am sure I would have gone back already. Chris was offered comeback fights, but he never fully considered it. There was names like Roberto Duran, Thomas Hearns, and even James Toney that had been put forward, and there was even talk of Roy Jones Jr. Chris didn't want to fight these people because his dignity could be challenged and, he would be brought into question. And for Chris, that was too precious for him. Why does he want to come back? He retired just before his 32nd birthday, which in boxing terms meant, he was a bit of an old man. If the phone rang tomorrow and he was offered $1 billion, he'd say no. He wouldn't do it because, for Chris Eubank, it is all about his dignity and respect and the value that holds in his life. The people who want to see Chris fight, again, remember how it was, and it'll never be better for Chris. As well as actual bouts, Chris has been approached in the past to promote fights and actually have a promoter's license, but he said that life doesn't appeal to him. Of course, he's been involved in a few bouts as a promoter, but it's not something that he wishes to do all of the time, as it involves Chris in matters that he doesn't feel comfortable with anymore. He's also been asked if he'd train young fighters. Chris believed he'd make an effective trainer because he can intimately break down what is in each move, plus he was taught by a great trainer, he said, and have competed at the highest level. The second reason Chris said that he gets more joy out of motivating people than anything, and why he doesn't train people in the physical sense, only in the mental sense, is because boxing is one of hundreds of trades, training the mind, talking to people about life, and for him there's nothing more important and all-encompassing than that. So, following his retirement from the sport, there was multiple things that he was involved in. He spent a lot of his time doing charity work, talking to youngsters, visiting educational institutions, doing television and radio interviews, and taking part in television programmes. One particular one was the Gladiators programme, which I'll talk about very shortly. And there never seems to be a minute spare for Chris. He mentions that there was one fun job he did after retirement, which was a show called Eubank's People on Talk Radio, and he invited guests such as Naseem Hamed, Lennox Lewis, Linford Christie and John Fashanu into the studio, and they talked about all different kinds of stuff. Anyone in the UK who listens to Talk Radio might remember that. Chris said he really enjoyed it, but they said that he talked too much more than the guests did. There was also another programme that you guys might remember, and for those in America and all across the world who haven't seen it, it's probably still worth watching, even though it's quite old now. He did Celebrity Big Brother, and then the BBC approached him to take part in a programme with Louis Theroux. So Louis Theroux and his camera crew were to follow Chris around for 45 hours for their programme over a period of 10 days. And in many ways, it was kind of like the pilot for a future show, At Home with the Eubanks, again, another show that was aired that people might have watched. For Chris, this was an opportunity to show the public that he's actually an ordinary guy. He has the truck, the monocle, a cane and a bike, but in essence, he's just a family man. He's not ashamed of having fun. Chris said he had no control over the edit or the final outcome of that show, but he felt like he achieved his objective and created fun, entertaining television. Louis Theroux is a very likeable person, but you've got to understand that he doesn't do these things for the people involved. He actually does it to try and get the entertainment value for the public and put that feather in his cap. There's also a lot of work that Chris has done as well following the retirement of his career to support Michael Watson. Everything that he's been asked to do regarding Michael Watson, he's happily done, and will always continue to do so. So, when Geraldine Davis, Michael's PA, asked Chris whether he'd walked the last mile of the 2003 London Marathon with Michael, Chris, of course, said yeah. And he's been to many, many charity events, testimonials and interviews, but this would be something, that'd be quite personal to him. And back in November 2002, there was an event that lots of fighters like Lennox Lewis and Frank Bruno turned up to, as well as many other non-boxing celebrities. It was at Grosvenor House, and in order to raise money, Chris had his picture taken with people who would pay £10 for the experience, and also sold his autograph for £5. By the end of the night, he raised over £1,500 for Michael. Frank Warren wanted to take the money he'd raised and add it to the rest of the money, but Chris refused and wanted to hand over his contribution personally. Chris said he didn't realise how emotional the marathon walk would actually be. He said it was very, very moving. He said, I stepped out of the coach at one point and welled up. Michael was being interviewed by a woman at Sky News Live at the time. Then she turned to Chris and said, Chris, how do you feel? Chris didn't have any words, and he felt ashamed, and he said it, and he still couldn't find the words and knew that the word ashamed was wrong because he meant inspired. And she said, why are you ashamed? Chris said, because I'm part and parcel of why this happened, but inspired because of the response and by how much Michael has been able to recover and do what he's doing. Now, long before he's at home with the Eubank show, he was approached to take part in a one-off series called Gladiator, Ben versus Eubank, with Nigel Benn. Back in 1995, the same production company had made a documentary about Eubank and Benn called Clash of the Titans. They seemed a little obsessed with them, but it goes to show what an impact both of them made. People still remember the titanic brutal fights and the pose, the showmanship that they both brought to the ring. While the latest venture was far more grueling, both mentally and physically, than Chris expected. He considers himself an accomplished man, and you become accomplished by finding out who you are in terms of situations that arise. To look Nigel Benn in the eye, you would have to come to terms with who you are and what you do. And for Chris, Ben is the most terrifying man he ever met. In school, there was the kind of kid, if you got on the wrong side of, you would just have to fight for no real reason. Even if you beat him, it was just a no-win situation because there would be too much pain involved in defeating him. Well, for Chris Eubank, Nigel Benn was that kid. The idea of a programme was to have Chris and Nigel train as gladiators in a recently opened gladiatorial school just outside Rome and take part in a 3-round 4-minute bout at the end of the week of hard training. The trainers, Spartacus and Brutus, would teach them how to use the weapons the gladiators used, and they would have to also eat the same food for the full authentic experience. This was a show for television, so Chris wasn't really taking it that seriously. He was just keen to inject humour into the proceedings. So when they were eating squid one day, he's sitting there and he's doing it rough, taking his food out of the bowl with a scowl on his face, while drinking the water, letting it dribble out of his mouth, and he said, I do believe they call this calamari. At the end of the day, it was a game show, but due to its particularly tough nature, Chris didn't think the format would have worked with anyone else other than boxers. Say like a footballer, for instance, would not have been tough enough to do it in that way. But Ben was probably happy for the contest. Chris wasn't. Chris felt it was an appalling situation that they put him in. They were trained in the use of various weapons and would then have to compete against each other in a series of small challenges, which was to culminate in the big fight at the end of the week. For one task, they were required to race twice around the amphitheatre with 2 25-pound sacks in 100-degree heat. At one point, Chris had to put them down and pick them up again because they were so heavy, and he lost his grip on the sacks because his palms were so sweaty. During that race, Chris was behind Ben up until the last few metres and was able to overtake him and win the race. But as Chris overtook him, he let out this roar and redoubled his efforts to win. But Chris had already won and had to shout him, I've already won, it's over. Such was Nigel Benn's will to win. Chris was winding him up all the time in front of everyone to make him angry. And of course Nigel Benn didn't need very much encouragement because he was bubbling over all the time. Chris said to one of the film crew, can't you see it? He's like a volcano going to erupt. And sure enough, he did. 3 men were attacking them with balls on the end of sticks covered in paint. The point being that you would have to defend yourself against these attackers, and if they hit you, it would show up as paint on your body. But to add extra spice, Eubank and Ben were together and had to defend each other against the attackers. By the end of it, Ben had more paint on his body than Eubank and started to complain, saying, listen, my legs are red and yours are not, which means really, that I was protecting your legs more than you were protecting me. Now at this point, Chris makes a funny gesture to the camera because he can't even believe that he said that and he's taking it so serious. Then Nigel Benn goes mental, shouting and swearing, and then he pushes Chris. He fronted up to him and was in his face. Chris wasn't going to be intimidated by him. It was all getting a bit ugly and tense, so the trainers and the camera crew rushed in to pull him apart. One of the producers, to keep order, said, "We've got 3 or 4 more days of work, so let's calm down, give me your hands, and let's just shake," which they did. To further help things along, Chris added, "But you know, like I do, you got one up because you pushed me, and now we're equal." And Chris pushed him back. Then Eubank kicked off again, and they were kept apart for 2 days, so things would cool down. Of course, it was fantastic television, and if you've not seen that video of them going face to face against one another, I posted it not long ago on the BTR social media pages, so please go back and watch it. It's hilarious. It's just, you can see how tense Nigel Benn always was. Well, all that training didn't prepare Chris for that final battle. He had injured his neck after the second day of training, and he was quite honest and said, "I wasn't 100% committed. It was only 75% up for it, and it was more intense and physical than what they expected it to be." The first 3 of the bouts was with a sword and a shield. It was only a plastic sword and a heavy leather-covered shield, but Nigel Benn was coming at Chris Eubank like a madman, slashing and kicking, and the armour that they had to wear to protect themselves was very constricting, so it was difficult to manoeuvre. Chris was thinking, "What am I doing here with this, man? I don't need this." The second round, with a mace, again plastic, was even worse. Trying to block and counter-attack with your own mace was really difficult, added to the fact that Chris had an injured neck and he was restricted, and then he's being attacked by this committed man in Nigel Benn who was more willing than he was. The final round was to be Greco-Roman wrestling, where Nigel held on to the back of Chris's belt and Chris held on to his, and the idea being like sumo wrestling. Chris kept thinking that it was going to be such an undignified affair that he really didn't want to do it, and again with his neck restricting his movement, he didn't think he could win the event. He told producers after the second event that his neck was bad and that he was really thinking about forfeiting the wrestling, but the producers didn't seem to believe him. They thought it'd just be a matter of pride and that he would feel like he had to carry on or lose face. They said to him, "Well, if you want to forfeit, then you can. That's your prerogative." So he did. Chris hadn't lost face in any way, but he'd lost the first 2 rounds and forfeited the last, so he lost the game. But in Chris's eyes, at least, it was the end of what he felt was an awful experience, for which he said he was grossly underpaid, considering what they actually had to endure. His final word on that Gladiators TV show was, "Hey, I lost. I'm very accepting of it. It's no big thing to me, but if it makes him happy, then fantastic." At the end of the whole event, Nigel walks over to Chris and his wife, and where the camera crew are, and some of the crowd, who can all hear, and he says, "It's nice to even the score." Chris's wife was amazed and repeated his words in disbelief. Even the score? Chris took his soul, he felt, when he beat him in 1990. He was sobbing on Richard Steele's shoulder. He stopped him then, but this was a game. But boxing was the real thing. When Chris was in the ring, he felt he was box office. He was a showman, and although he's not boxing anymore, he still has that flair for the dramatics. That show particularly gave him the opportunity to demonstrate what is obvious, that no man, or rather no person, is only one thing. That in many things, Chris is an entertainer who can be philosophical, poetical, a sportsman, paternal. The public will always have an opinion about Chris Eubank, and Chris would rather them see the good than the bad, the positive rather than the negative, and Chris feels like he's now able to get his point across more effectively because he does it in such a humorous way. Of course, following all these shows, following all these appearances, Chris Eubank Jr. then turns professional, and Chris plays, I'd say, quite a pivotal part in the early part of Chris Eubank Jr.'s career. When he first started, he was getting in the ring in between rounds and being just Chris Eubank. You'll all remember it when Chris Eubank Jr. started fighting. And of course, at the point of recording this, we're now at a stage where Chris Eubank Jr. is about to fight Conor Benn. And it's like those two are trying to kind of recapture the glory of Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr. So this whole career profile really was in line with the fact that this fight is coming up very, very soon at the point of recording this episode. It might have already happened now that you're listening to it, but one thing's for sure, Chris Eubank produced one hell of a legendary career. People might not agree with me, but for me, Chris Eubank was a focal part of my childhood growing up. Watching Chris Eubank even today on his own YouTube channel that he's just set up, Call with Chris Eubank, where fans can actually leave voice notes for him and he responds to them on the show. Watching some of those stories being retold that have been told on these 3 parts for the Chris Eubank career profile. Always fantastic. He's obviously done a lot of events over the years. They even did a little tour with Nigel Benn where they kind of buried the hatchet, and there'll always be that animosity between them because of that gladiatorial life that they had with one another and that rivalry. One of the fiercest rivalries that I think we've ever seen in boxing. And also a rivalry that recovered for our Legendary Night series. Myself and Johnston did a whole episode on the tale of Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn. So as a really good episode to accompany this career profile, I would highly recommend you do go and listen to that episode, as well as Nigel Benn's career profile. Of course, we've got Nigel Benn's perspective on all of this stuff that we spoke about with their rivalry as well. So please do go and check those episodes out. Now, before we come to the end of the show, there is just one more thing I want to do. Just one more quote that I want to deliver to you guys from Chris Eubank. And it goes, "For peace of mind, the following 3 virtues must be applied and adhered to: integrity, reason, and forgiveness. The true warrior is a creature of irony, for his genuine task is to ensure peace." Poetical, as always, Mr. Chris Eubank. I really, really hope that you guys have enjoyed Chris Eubank's career profile. I didn't go into all the other stuff regarding At Home with the Eubanks or his Gogglebox appearance, because I quite simply didn't think you guys would want to hear any of that stuff. So I only kept in bits of his entertainment value, i.e. the Gladiators show and obviously the marathon stuff with Michael Watson, because I only felt they were really relevant to the story. Like some of the stuff that he does now is just Eubank, man. Like he's just typical Chris Eubank, and there'll still be more stories yet to come, still be more chapters left in Chris Eubank's life. You know, we've not been speaking to Chris Eubank Jr. at the point of recording this episode and this story. I think a lot of us feel like we want to see him there in the corner. You know, be there at Chris Eubank Jr.'s side ahead of the Conor Benn fight. And hopefully, by the time you've listened to this, that will have happened and we will have had a really interesting fight between the two of them. But one thing's for sure, anybody that's of a certain age bracket, anybody that's, I'd say, 35 and upwards, listening to this show will probably feel the same level of nostalgia that I do. And it's not just the nostalgia of Chris Eubank's career profile. When you think of Chris Eubank, you either love the guy or you hated the guy, but what you couldn't deny was that he brought entertainment value to your screens, not just inside the ring, but outside of it, and the things that he would do. I mean, there's so many people that have not been able to experience what it was like to live in that period of time. And that's why it makes me so nostalgic, because I remember it growing up as a child, as a boxing fan. I feel sorry for those that didn't get the opportunity to live in that time, to really experience it. And they can only live vicariously through their parents or their siblings, whoever it is. So for me, it was really pertinent that I wanted to make sure I produced this episode really to accompany the Legendary Nights episode and the Nigel Benn episode that we've done as well. So if this is the first career profile you've listened to, or one of the few career profiles you've listened to, please go and listen to the Nigel Benn one as well. He has an amazing story also. But then there's the Legendary Nights, where we do go a lot deeper into certain fights and how pivotal they were. I hope you've enjoyed it, guys. If you have, please let me know. If you've been listening on Spotify, leave a comment below. Thank you very much for those that have already done that. If you are listening on YouTube, again, thank you for listening on YouTube. Thank you for leaving your comments. I truly, truly do appreciate the support that I'm getting and all the hard work that goes into putting these things together and the time it takes to record and produce them for you guys. Yeah, it's quite a lot of time. So I do appreciate when people do come back and acknowledge the fact that you've enjoyed it and that I've done a good job. So thank you so much for continuing to do that. If you've got any further thoughts and feelings, any more career profiles that you want me to do, I've got a couple of suggestions recently. I am going to explore a few of those suggestions. I have got a few more plans for the Career Profiles podcast. My intention is then to move on to the dark side of boxing a little bit later this year, but there's a couple more episodes left for Career Profiles to do before I move back to that show. One final shout out. I've got to do it. It's to you guys on Patreon. You guys that are supporting me, that are so loyal to the cause. I really, really, truly appreciate the fact that you are still there supporting me. I am trying my best to continue to bring some more Patreon-only content. I've released an early preview of Eubank versus Ben, the nostalgia of the sons fighting one another. There's a preview on there for you guys if you haven't already heard it. And then there's going to be more content where Luke is going to be involved as well in doing some of those Patreon-only episodes. So thank you for supporting me from that perspective as well. If you do want to become a patron, there's very minimal fees to pay to do it. You know, you can pay the very minimal fee and get access to stuff earlier than everybody else. There's episodes that have never been released to the general public. Loads of episodes there. You know, I really appreciate the support. I can't thank you enough for the additional support that I'm getting for that. But this is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is the final part of Chris Eubank's career profile. I really, really thoroughly hope you've enjoyed his life story. And thank you for listening to myself on Career Profiles on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network.